In this video, I'm showing you how voting systems can be manipulated. I'll give an example. I have another video that looks at Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves mathematically that there's no perfect voting system. Voting systems are always inherently fragile or unfair or able to be manipulated, and I'm going to show how that works. And if you ever happen to encounter this situation after watching this video, you will be able to set the agenda of the voting to your favor. That's not what I encourage. It's probably not super ethical, but if there's no perfect voting system, you're kind of in a pickle anyway. So here's the situation. We have a local government, and there's people elected to the board of that government who decide how to use the money that comes in through taxes. It's not a whole lot of money, but it supports their local economy and it supports their parks and such. And one year they have more money than they had allocated to spend, so they have to vote among them about how to spend that money. And there's basically three factions of people on this board. A third of the people think they should give it to schools, and that's their first choice. If not schools, they should allocate the money towards improving parks in their local town, but their least favorite option is the tax cut. Then there's the second group who prefers the tax cut. That's their favorite policy. If not the tax cut, they like schools second best, and their least favorite one is parks. And then the third group prefers parks more than the tax cut, more than schools. And of course, this curly inequality symbol is economists' way of saying this is preferred to this. It's a way of expressing preferences. The voting system is going to be an agenda that pits two of these options against one another, and then whatever wins that vote goes against the third option. So as we think about this, let's imagine that you are in Group A, and you would like to manipulate the vote to get what you want, which is the money going towards schools. In which case, as we go through this exercise, I'd like you to think about how to make that happen. And you might even pause the video to see if you can figure this out. So let's just try a random agenda first. So let's try schools versus parks, and then the winner versus the tax cut. And we can figure out what happens for the vote. And let's just imagine that it's a 3-person committee, although it would work exactly the same if it were a 9-person committee or an 18-person committee, as long as there's equal numbers in all 3 groups. Or sometimes even slightly off from equal numbers in all 3 groups, you're going to get a similar situation. So here we have schools versus parks. So Group A votes for schools. Group B votes for schools. Group C votes for parks. So schools wins that, so we have schools versus the tax cut. In schools versus the tax cut, who wins? Well, we can figure this out as well. So schools versus tax cut, Group A votes schools. Group B votes for the tax cut. Group C votes for the tax cut. So the outcome of this voting is that we are going to cut taxes. Okay, that's fine. Well, let's see what happens if we rearrange the agenda for the voting. So instead of schools versus parks, let's do schools versus the tax cut first. And I should say, before we go through this, now would be a good time to stop the video and see if you can figure out how to set up the agenda for the voting such that schools wins, because after this, it might become obvious. All right, so here's the new agenda. Let's see what happens. Schools versus tax cut. Group A votes for schools. Group B votes for the tax cut. Group C votes for the tax cut. So now we have tax cut versus parks. For the second round, tax cut versus parks, we have Group A votes for parks. Group B votes for the tax cut. Group C votes for parks. So the outcome. So we've just shown that the way you set up the agenda for this voting will determine the outcome of the vote. It's clear that whoever has the power to set the agenda really has the power to determine the outcome. And you may have noticed that whatever outcome is in this particular position is going to win the vote. So if you want schools to win, the optimal way to set this up would be this agenda is going to yield a winner of schools. We're going to end up voting schools as the optimal choice. And so now you know how to manipulate this vote. You know that this vote is entirely manipulatable based on the original preferences of these three groups. So we've seen how this voting system is really hard to deal with. In fact, how do you come up with a voting system that's fair if there's these three people or these three groups with equal numbers? It's actually virtually impossible to come up with a collective preference for this group of voters. So the purpose of this video is to show you that many voting systems are easily manipulatable, and sometimes the person who sets the voting agenda or who chooses the style of voting that happens, that person can sometimes have a big influence on the outcome of a vote.